Misconceptions and stereotypes of the African American race. As a whole, African Americans are believed to possess many of the same characteristics. African Americans are affiliated with being poorer, more likely to be raised in single-parent homes, and more crime and violence ridden than the general population. These perceptions can be partially attributed to the way African Americans have been portrayed in the media throughout history. For instance, African Americans in movies were once widely synonymous with the Sambo image, which, according to historian Stanley Elkins, displayed blacks as docile but irresponsible, loyal but lazy, humble but chronically given to lying and stealing. Movies such as Boys in the Hood, Friday, and Menace to Society presented blacks as simple-minded, superstitious, and submissive. Though the Sambo image has virtually disappeared, the remnants of the generalizations still lingered. As Sambo died out, African Americans began to be portrayed as super spade, or triumphant, sensational, and always likely to come out on top. This image played on the belief that in order to be successful, African Americans had to outperform and exceed their white counterparts. This can be seen in movies such as Shaft, where the main character is seen as indestructible, flippant, and triumphant. Along with this, inequalities and the maltreatment of blacks throughout history has also left lingering stereotypes on the race as a whole. Due to these inequalities, blacks have sometimes had to endure extreme negative misconceptions and stereotypes concerning the race. Though many Americans will say that racial discrimination is merely a thing of the past, a study conducted by CBS News' Social Science Research Solutions indicated that 40% of blacks say that they are still discriminated against today, compared to only 15% of whites that say that. How, then, have these perceptions of African Americans throughout history affected the race as a whole today? The phenomenon. Due to the application of preconceived notions, an entire race is largely generalized to all exhibit the same behaviors. Lazy, unmotivated, crime-ridden, and less likely to perform well are all characteristics given to the African American race. When blacks do excel, they are often deemed an exception. Relationships, careers, the family, and social institutions are all examples of aspects that are affected by the phenomenon of misconceptions and stereotypes being applied to the African American race. If misconceptions continue to surface, there will always be an unnecessary bias within society in which African Americans are prejudged and possibly discriminated against. The importance in understanding this phenomenon is the same for understanding the misconceptions and stereotypes of any other race, group of people, or individual. The negative connotations associated with stereotyping an entire race can be damaging, as it can cause direct or indirect confrontation, hostility, and hindrances. Although it is impossible to eliminate in the eyes of all, the riddance of common negative misconceptions of the African American population can make way for an equality that has been long sought after by its people. Multiple theories can be used to explain how the phenomenon of the misconceptions and stereotypes of African Americans affects the race on a macro level. First is the interactionist theory. One symbolic interactionist perspective, the labeling theory, is an attempt to explain why certain people are viewed as deviant and others engaging in the same behavior are not. Howard Becker, a proponent of the labeling theory, points out that one can commit deviant behaviors without being labeled, while others can be incorrectly labeled for presumed wrongdoing. American sociologist William Thomas observed that the definition of the situation could mold the personality of the individual. Common mistreatment or labeling leads to the conforming behavior of man. In result, society will view this behavior and react accordingly. They will form stereotypes and hence discriminate. Likewise, the conflict theory can be applied to this phenomenon. The conflict theory asserts that conflict is an instrument for social change in which people who have power struggle to maintain the status quo, whereas people without power fight to change the system and make it fairer. It is evident that conflict brings upon social change, and this has been the case for African Americans throughout history. When blacks were enslaved, they rebelled and fought along with the help of Caucasians to seek freedom and equality. Likewise, blacks fought for change during the civil rights movement. The continuous presence of conflict was needed in order to change the social status of black people. Even today, thousands of blacks strive to rid themselves of the negative stigma affiliated with the race and display individual capabilities by pursuing higher education, successful careers, and engaging in various jobs and fields as the minority. The macro to the micro level. In looking at the bigger picture, misconceptions and misunderstandings can lead to stereotypes, discrimination, and racism. These conflicts can form either advocacy or confrontation not only within the African American community, but within society as a whole. An example of advocacy would stem from an advocate of equality, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As Dr. King once said, a man should be judged not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. Dr. King fought misconception with peace and intelligence, and his techniques alone trumped several stereotypes that blacks tend to resort to violence to solve problems. In contrast to Dr. King's peaceable techniques, the Black Panther Party used radical, confrontational measures to respond to the misconceptions and oppression of blacks. As a whole, many blacks say that they have become who and where they are as a direct result of this phenomenon. We saw earlier in the semester how individuals are affected from the macro to the micro level by the application of stereotypes to blacks from the vandalization video. If you recall, the video shows two scenarios, one in which white teenagers vandalize a car in a public park, and a second in which black teenagers vandalize a car in the same park. When showing the reactions of onlookers, the producers found that black kids generated more calls to the police than their white counterparts. Even more disturbing was that rather than calling the police on the white children vandalizing cars, witnesses called the police about black teenagers sleeping in a nearby car. This reiterates the negative stereotypes associated with African Americans and the ways in which race alone is a means for people to be discriminated against in everyday life. The micro to the macro level. African Americans can internalize societal views and exhibit behaviors they are believed to possess, which is known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. While many blacks strive to disprove the negative stereotypes affiliated with the race, some blacks internalize the prejudices and feed into the labels applied to them. For instance, gangs and imprisoned African Americans distrust and resent the greater society because they believe that the society as a whole do not care for their well-being. Misconceptions and mistreatments leads to many different reactions from African Americans. It can lead to violence or advocacy, the internalization of stereotypes, or the desire to disprove the negative connotations. Unfortunately, misconceptions can turn to reality. The following myths are associated with the black community. Myth 1. Black-on-black crime is uniquely bad. In reality, most crime is committed by people who know each other. It's as segregated as the rest of America. Therefore, black-on-black crime is no different from crimes committed by any other race. Myth number 2. Violent crimes amongst African Americans is on the rise. In reality, crime is down sharply all over the country. Myth number 3. Justice is applied to all equally. In reality, crime prevention and enforcement policies target people of color disproportionately. In conclusion, blacks have had and continue to have power struggles within society. Stereotypes and misconceptions have contributed in placing blacks in not so desirable categories within society. In America, we pride ourselves on individuality, freedom, and pride. Why then is an entire race being widely viewed as one? It is important to remember that regardless of the media's portrayal or of lingering stereotypes of a race, class, gender, or age group, that no two people are alike. The growth and progression of the African American race relies on the reactions or personal experiences that follow the phenomenon of African American misconception. Elimination of this phenomenon would eliminate several other social phenomena dealing with inequalities as well. Society could then focus on different marvels of man alone, rather than creating labels that African Americans feel obligated to either honor or disobey.